Variable substitutions and dabs. Databricks asset bundles support substitutions and custom variables, making your bundle configuration files more modular and reusable. Both substitutions and custom variables allow dynamic retrieval of values, meaning that settings can be determined at the time the bundle is deployed and run. To use a variable in your YAML file, reference it using a $, curly braces, and the mapping, then the variable name. By default, a variety of substitutions are available. Some common ones are shown on the screen. A few to keep in mind include bundle.target to get the value of the target environment, workspace.filePath for the workspace file path, and resources.jobs.job name or ID to name a few. You can also use simple custom variables you define in your Databricks asset bundle. Custom variables allow you to enable dynamic retrieval of values needed for specific scenarios. These variables are declared in your bundle configuration files within the variables mapping. For example, under the variables top-level mapping, you can specify any number of custom variables. In this example, we'll create a variable named myLabUserName, followed by a description and its default value of LabUser23904. In this example, we'll create a variable named myLabUserName, followed by a description and its default value of LabUser23904. You can define both simple and complex custom variables in your Databricks asset bundles to enable dynamic retrieval of values for various scenarios. By default, a simple custom variable is assumed to be of type string. However, if you need more complex data, you can define a custom variable as a complex type using the type complex mapping. For example, in this case, we create a complex variable named my_cluster with a default value specifying the Spark version, node type, and the number of workers. Let's look at an example of creating and referencing simple custom variables in your Databricks.yaml file. First, you define the variable's top-level mapping. Under Variables, you can add your custom variables. The bundle setting file can only contain one top-level variables mapping where all your custom variables are defined. In this example, we'll create a variable named myLabUserName with a default value of LabUser23904. You can then reference the custom variable myLabUserName within other variables or mappings. In this example, we will use the myLabUserName variable to create two new variables, catalogDev and catalogProd, appending the strings _1_dev and _3_prod to the correct variables. To reference a custom variable, use a $, then use the top-level mapping var, followed by a dot and the variable name, myLabUserName, within curly braces, and then append the literal string after that variable. As a result, the catalog_dev variable will be equal to LabUser23904_1_dev, and the catalog_prod variable will be equal to LabUser23904_3_prod. This technique allows you to reference or override variables throughout the Databricks.yaml file. We will look at more examples of how to apply this. By default, a variable is assumed to be type string unless you define it as a complex variable. In this example, we define the variable myCluster as type complex and specify its default values. This allows you to provide more structured data for the variable, such as specifying a Spark version, node type, and number of workers. For specific object types, you can define a lookup for your custom variable to retrieve the object's ID using this format. First, specify the variable name. In this example, the variable is called myClusterID. Then, use the lookup mapping to define what to look up. In this case, we are looking up the cluster name, myClusterName, to retrieve the corresponding cluster ID value. If a lookup is defined for a variable, the ID of the object with the specified name is used as the value for that variable. This ensures the correct resolved ID of the object is always used. You can use lookup variables for the alert, cluster policy, cluster, dashboard, instance pool, job, metastore, notification destination, pipeline, query, service principal, and warehouse object types at the time of this recording. Custom variables can then be used throughout your Databricks.yaml file. One of the places you can use these is within your targets mapping. This allows you to dynamically modify variable values for each target environment. For example, let's say we have a custom variable named target catalog that is used to populate a job parameter to read and write data from a specific catalog. You can modify its value for each environment. In this case, when deploying to the development environment, the target catalog variable will use the catalog_dev value. When deploying to production, the target_catalog variable will use the catalog_prod value. If you do not specify an override for your variable, it will default to its original value. Please be aware that the default value for the variable must be defined in the variable's top-level mapping for an override to work. If a variable is not assigned to a default value, the override will not function as expected. There are several benefits to using variables in your Databricks.yaml bundle configuration file. First, you can customize them for different environments. Variables allow you to easily modify configurations such as catalogs, file paths, and other settings for development, staging, and production environments. They provide reusability across Databricks projects. You can use the same asset bundle across multiple teams or workspaces by adjusting only the variable values, promoting consistency, and reducing redundancy. Lastly, you can easily maintain and update them. With variables, you can quickly update assets and configurations, ensuring consistency across environments and reducing the risk of errors.